Hello. Before I start reading this book, I'm just going to say a few words about my own relationship to Paul Brunton. Now, I didn't know Paul Brunton, and I didn't know of him, but a couple of months ago, I came across his book, and it was called A Hermit in the Himalayas. And the title grabbed me, and I started reading it, and his writing really knocked me for a loop, I must say, because his prose is so much like poetry at points. I found after I finished reading that book here on YouTube, I missed hearing from him. It was like something was missing from my life, It was, yeah. So anyhow, that's why I chose another book. So looking at the books he's written, I came across this one. This seems to be the first book that he wrote, and it was apparently a hit. So, in it, he talks about meeting Ramana Maharshi. Well, Ramana Maharshi has long been someone of interest to me. I read one of his books, 20 years ago or so. Was very influenced by it. And then I came across Muni Sadhu. And Muni Sadhu wrote a book called In Times of Great Peace. Yeah, that was it. In Times of Great Peace, where he was an Australian, and he went to India and actually spent some time with Ramana Maharshi. So loved that book. Loved some of his other books, Muni Sadhu's books. Must admit, though, I did not read all of his books because as he got more into the obscurities of, the occult, he lost me. Maybe I'll return to him. But it was very interesting reading that. And I'm looking forward to reading this one. So it's called A Search in Secret India. And I hope you enjoy it too. So this is chapter 1, and it's entitled Wherein I Bow to the Reader. There is an obscure passage in the yellowed book of Indian life which I have endeavored to elucidate for the benefit of Western readers. Early travelers returned home to Europe with weird tales of the Indian fakirs, and even modern travelers occasionally bring similar stories. What is the truth behind those legends which come ever and anon to our ears, concerning a mysterious class of men called yogis, by some, and fakirs by others? What is the truth behind the fitful hints which reach us, intimating that there exists in India an old wisdom that promises the most extraordinary development of mental powers to those who practice it? I set out on a long journey to find it, and the following pages summarize my report. Summarize, I say, because the inexorable exigencies of space and time require me to write of one yogi where I had met more. Therefore, I have selected a few who interested me most and who seemed likely to interest the Western world. One heard much of certain so-called holy men who possessed repute of having acquired deep wisdom and strange powers. So one traveled through scorching days and sleepless nights to find them, only to find scriptural slaves, venerable know-nothings, money-seeking conjurers, jugglers with a few tricks, and to fill my pages with the records of such people would be worthless to the reader and a distasteful task to me. Therefore, I omit the tale of time wasted upon them. I feel quite humbly that I've been privileged to see a remote aspect of India, seldom seen and less understood by ordinary travelers. Among the English residents in that vast land, only an infinitesimal fraction has cared to study this aspect, and of this fraction, very few were free enough to examine it more deeply and give their report, for official dignity must needs be respected. Therefore, English writers who have touched on this subject swing over to a hearty skepticism, which, by its very nature, renders many sources of native knowledge not readily available to them, and which causes the Indian who really knows something about the less superficial side of matter to shrink from discussing it with him. The white man will, in most cases, possess but an imperfect acquaintance with the yogis, if he knows them at all, and certainly not with the best of them. The latter are now but a mere handful in the very country of their origin. They are exceedingly rare, are fond of hiding their true attainment from the public, and prefer to pose as ignoramuses. In India, in Tibet, and in China, they get rid of the Western traveler who may happen to blunder in on their privacy by maintaining a studied appearance of insignificance and ignorance. Perhaps they would see some sense in Emerson's abrupt phrase, quote, "To be great is to be misunderstood," end quote. I do not know. Anyway, they are mostly recluses who do not care to mingle with mankind. Even when met, they are unlikely to break their reserve except after some period of acquaintance. Hence, little has been written in Western continents about the strange life of these yogis, and even that remains vague. The reports of Indian writers are indeed available, but they must be read with care. It is an unfortunate fact that the Orientals often mix hearsay with fact quite indiscriminately. Therefore, such reports diminish in value as documentary records. When I verified this through chastening experience, I thanked heaven for such scientific training as the West has given me, and for the common sense attitude which journalistic experience has instilled in me. There is a basis of genuine fact underlying much Oriental superstition, but profound vigilance is needed to discover it. I was compelled to keep a critical but not hostile eye widely open wherever I went. Not a few of those who learned that I was interested in the mystical and the miraculous, apart from my philosophical concerns, applied liberal paint and plentiful varnish to their few facts. I might have spent my day trying to teach them that truth is so strong she can stand on her own two legs without falling to the ground, and I had other things to do. I felt glad, however, that I had preferred to gain my knowledge of Oriental wonders at first hand, just as I prefer Christ's wisdom to his commentators' ignorance. I searched through a welter of crass superstitions and ancient pretensions for those things which are true, which will stand the acid test of thorough investigation. I flatter myself that I could never have done this did I not contain within my complex nature the two elements of scientific skepticism and spiritual sensitivity, elements which usually range themselves in sharp conflict and flagrant opposition. I have entitled this book Secret India because it tells of an India which has been hidden from prying eyes for thousands of years, which has kept itself so exclusive that today only its rapidly disappearing remnants are left. The manner in which the yogis kept their knowledge so esoteric may appear selfish to us in these democratic days, but it helps to account for their gradual disappearance from visible history. Thousands of Englishmen live in India, and hundreds visit it every year. yet few know anything of what one may one day prove more worthy to the world than even the prized pearls and valuable stones which ships bring us from India. Fewer still have taken the trouble to go out of their way to find the adepts in yoga, while not one Englishman in 1,000 is prepared to prostrate himself before a brown, half-naked figure in some lonely cave or in a disciple-filled room. Such is the inevitable barrier imposed by this form of caste, that even men of generous character and developed intellect, if suddenly taken from their habitations in British quarters and set down in a cave, would find a yogi's company uncongenial and his ideas unintelligible. Yet, the Englishman in India, whether soldier, civil servant, businessman, or traveler, is not to be blamed because he is too proud to squat on the mat of the yogi. Quite apart from the business of upholding British prestige, doubtless an important and necessary procedure, the kind of holy man he usually encounters is more likely to repel than attract. It is certainly no loss to avoid such a man. Nevertheless, it is a pity that after a sojourn of many years, the English resident will often leave the country in blameless ignorance of what lies behind the frontal brain of an Indian sage. I plainly remember my interview with a Cockney under the shadow of Trichinopoly's gigantic rock fort. For over 20 years, he had held a responsible post on the Indian railways. It was inevitable that I should ply him with many questions about his life in this sunburned land. Finally, I trotted out my pet interrogation. "Have you met any yogis?" He looked at me somewhat blankly and then replied, "Yogis? What are they? Some kind of animal?" Such ignorance would have been perfectly pardonable had he stayed at home within the sound of Bow bells. B-O-W, bells. Now, after 26 years' residence in the country, it was perfectly blissful. I permitted it to remain undisturbed. Because I put pride underfoot in moving among the varied people who inhabit Hindustan, because I gave them a ready understanding and an intellectual sympathy, a freedom from finicky prejudice, and a regard for character irrespective of color, and because I had sought truth all my life and was prepared to accept whatever truth brought in its train, I am able to write this record. I picked my way through a crowd of superstitious fools and self-styled fakirs in order to sit at the feet of true sages, there to learn at first hand the real teachings of Indian yoga. I squatted on the floor in many a secluded hermitage, surrounded by faces and hearing strange dialects. I sought out those reserved and reclusive men, the best yogis, and I listened humbly to their oracular instruction. I talked for hours with the Brahmin pundits of Benares, discussing the age-old questions of philosophy and belief, which have tormented the mind and troubled the heart of a man since he first began to think. I stopped now and then to divert myself with the magician and wonder worker, and strange incidents crossed my trails. I wanted to gather the real facts about the yogis of today by the method of first-hand investigation. I prided myself that experience as a journalist fitted me to draw out, with the least possible delay, much of the information which I sought. That sitting at the editorial desk and curtly wielding the blue pencil had trained me to become ruthlessly critical in separating wheat from chaff, and that the contact with men and women in every grade of life, which the profession generally gives, with ragged mendicants as well as well-fed millionaires, would help me move just a little more smoothly through the variegated masses of India, among whom I searched for those strange men, the yogis. On the other side of the sheet, I had lived an inner life totally detached from my outward circumstance. I spent much of my spare time in the study of recondite books and in little-known bypaths of psychological experiment. I delved into subjects which have always been wrapped in Cimmerian, Cimmerian, mystery. To these items must be added an inborn attraction towards things Oriental. The East, before my first visit, threw out vast tentacles that gripped my soul. Ultimately, they drew me to study the sacred books of Asia, the learned commentaries of her pundits, and the inscribed thoughts of her sages, so far as English translations could be procured. The dual experience proved of great value. It taught me never to permit my sympathy with Oriental methods of probing life's mysteries to subvert my scientific desire of critically and impartially finding the facts. Without that sympathy, I could never have gone among people and into places where the average Englishman in India may disdain to tread. Without that strict scientific attitude, I might have been led away from the wilderness of superstition. No, let me read that again. Without that strict scientific attitude, I might have been led away into the wilderness of superstition, as so many Indians seem to have been led away. It is not easy to conjoin qualities which are usually held to be contradictory, but I sincerely tried to hold them in sane balance. That the West has little to learn from present-day India, I shall not trouble to deny, but that we have much to learn from Indian sages of the past and from the few who live today, I unhesitatingly assert. The white tourist who does the chief cities and historical sites and then steams away with disgust at the backward civilization of India is doubtless justified in his deprecation of it, of his depreciation. No, of his depreciation, yes, of it. Yet, a wiser kind of tourist shall one day arise who will seek out not the crumbling ruins of the useless temples, nor the marbled palaces of dissipated kings long dead, but the living sages who can reveal a wisdom untaught by our universities. Are these Indians mere idlers, sprawling in the fierce tropic sun? Have they done nothing, thought nothing that is of worth to the rest of the world? The traveler who can see only their material degeneration and mental flabbiness has not seen far. Let him substitute consideration for his contempt, and he may open sealed lips and hidden doors. Grant that India has nodded and snored for centuries. Grant that even today there exist millions of peasants in this land who suffer the same illiteracy, share the same outlook, blended by puerile superstition and kindergarten religion, as did the English peasants of the 14th century. Grant further that the Brahmin pundits and native centers of learning Grant further that the Brahmin pundits and native centers of learning waste their useless years splitting sacerdotal hairs and drawing metaphysical wire as subtly as our medieval scholastics ever did. Yet there still remains a small but priceless residue of culture classified under the generic term yoga, which proffers benefits to mankind as valuable in their own way as any proffered by the Western sciences. It can bring our bodies nearer the healthy condition which nature intended them to possess. It can bestow one of modern civilization's most urgent needs, a flawless serenity of mind, and it can open the way to enduring treasures of the spirit to those who will labor for them. I admit that this great wisdom hardly belongs to India's present, but to her past, that this guarded knowledge of yoga flourishes little today when once it must have had worthy professors and faithful students. It may be that the secrecy in which it was carefully enshrouded succeeded in killing all spread of this ancient science. I do not know. It is perhaps not amiss then if one asks one's fellows, let me start that sentence over again. It is perhaps not amiss then if one asks one's Western fellows to look eastward, not for new faith, but for a few pebbles of knowledge, to cast upon our present heap. When Orientalists like Burnouf, Colebrook, and Max Muller appeared upon learning scene and brought us some of the literary treasures of India, the savants of Europe began to understand that the heathens who inhabited that country were not so stupid as our own ignorance had presumed. Those clever people who professed to find Asiatic learning empty of useful thoughts for the West, thereby proved their own emptiness. Those practical persons who would fling the epithet stupid at its study succeed only in flinging it at their own narrow-mindedness. If our ideas about life are to be wholly determined by a mere accident of space, by the chance that we were born in Bristol instead of Bombay, that we are not worthy of the name of civilized man, those who close their minds to the entrance of all Eastern ideas close them also to fine thoughts, deep truths, and worthwhile psychological knowledge. Whoever will poke about among this musty lore of the Orient in the hope of finding some precious gems of strange fact and stranger wisdom will find his quest no vain one. I journeyed eastward in search of the yogis and their hermetic knowledge. The thought of finding a spiritual light and diviner life was also entertained, though it was not my primary purpose. I wandered along the banks of India's holy rivers, the quiet gray-green Ganges, the broad Jumna, the picturesque Godavari. In this quest, I circled the country. India took me to her heart, and the vanishing remnant of her sages opened many a door for the unfamiliar Westerner. Not long ago, I was among those who regard God as a hallucination of human fancy, spiritual truth as a mere nebula, and providential justice as a confection for infantile idealists. I, too, was somewhat impatient of those who construct theological paradises and who then confidently show you round with an air of being God's estate agents. I had nothing but contempt for what seemed to be the futile, fanatical efforts of uncritical theorizers. If, therefore, I've begun to think a little differently about these matters, rest assured that good cause has given me. Yet, I did not arrive at paying allegiance to any Eastern creed. Indeed, those which matter I had already studied intellectually much earlier. I did arrive at a new acceptance of the divine. This may seem quite an insignificant and personal thing to do, but as a child of this modern generation, which relies on hard facts and cold reason, and which lacks enthusiasm for things religious, I regard it as quite an achievement. This faith was restored in the only way a skeptic could have it restored, not by argument, but by the witness of an overwhelming experience. And it was a jungle sage, an unassuming hermit, who had formerly lived for 6 years in a mountain cave, who had promoted this vital change in my thinking. It is quite possible that he could not pass a matriculation examination, yet I am not ashamed to record in the closing chapters of this book my deep indebtedness to this man. The production of such sages provides India with sufficient credentials to warrant attention from intelligent Westerners. The secret, India's spiritual life, still exists, despite the storms of political agitation which now hide it, and I have tried to give authentic record of more than one adept who has attained a strength and serenity for which we lesser mortals wistfully yearn. I have borne witness in this book to other things also, things marvelous and weird. They seem incredible now as I sit and type my narrative through the inked ribbon amid the matter-of-fact surroundings of English countryside. Indeed, I wonder at my temerity in writing them down for a skeptical world to read, but I do not believe the present materialistic ideas which dominate the world will remain for all time. Already one can perceive prophetic indications of a coming change of thought. Yet, quite frankly, I do not believe in miracles, neither do most men of my generation, but I do believe that our knowledge of nature's laws is incomplete, and that when the advance guard of scientists who are pushing forward into unexplored territory have found out a few more of those laws, we shall then be able to do things which are tantamount to miracles. And that concludes the first chapter. Chapter 2 is entitled A Prelude to the Quest. Wow. I'm really looking forward to reading this book, and I hope you'll join me for the next chapter and the whole book. And please subscribe and like. And if you'd like me to read any other books, if you have any suggestions, Paul Brunton books, or maybe Muni Sadhu books, or right now I'm reading a book by, what's her name? Alexandra David Neal, also about her exploration of the East. Just absolutely intriguing, and so till soon.